Welcome to another Front-End Engineering Explained. In today's video, we're going to look at anchor positioning again, CSS anchor positioning, but we're going to build something that I think you've probably either had to build or you've seen on the web quite a few times. And we're going to look at it in two ways. First, we're going to see how we might implement this today in Chromium browsers where anchor positioning is already supported. And then we're going to see how we can use CSS anchor positioning today through the amazing anchor positioning Polyfill from the folks over at Oddbird. So what we're building is, and what you've probably seen a lot is, let's say you have a list of cards like this, card components, and then you have a little button at the top that maybe has these little three dots or some other kind of icon. And when you click that, it opens up this flyout that has some options. Maybe it's a share and a view more and a download or something like that. But essentially, you click, you open a little flyout. Now, traditionally, this has been pretty tricky, especially like in this case where you just want to open it to the right-hand side. It's not that bad. But if you then come over here and you want to open it to the right-hand side, then of course you run into a problem. I've mentioned in my previous video how anchor positioning helps with that, with the fallbacks, the try fallbacks. Let's go. And if I look over to the left every now and again, I've made some notes that I just want to make sure I don't forget to mention important things. And then we just have an unordered list with a bunch, like 3 list items. And each of these is our card. That's just our media header and our content. And then here's that button. And then here is our flyout. And we're doing this with Popover, right? So we have a Popover target here. And then we're referencing the ID. And we're marking our unordered list here as our Popover. So this button controls this Popover. So right now, if we go and we click, of course, it sits here in the middle. Now, first things first, what we want to do is actually add margin 0. I'm adding it here to this utility class. And basically all this utility class does is I use that on the UL, so I don't have to repeat saying list style none, margin 0 on every unordered list where I want to turn off the list style and margin. Normally I even add padding 0 here, but in this case, it actually is more of a nuisance if I do it like this because the cascade, I'll be fighting the cascade. So I'm just like playing with the cascade, and instead I just have, I have a padding of 1 rem on the card options. Here you can see, and then on the episodes container, I just turn padding off over there. Now with margin 0 added, so it's adding margin 0 to the unordered list because the unordered list does have a margin by default. By doing that, now we've kind of pulled the popover out of that default centering, and it's sitting over here. But that's of course not what we want, right? And every time we click any of these, they're going to sit over there. Now this is where you'd normally have to bust out the JavaScript and start writing some JavaScript to get it to position there, or maybe you'll have some absolute positioning with some relative positioning, stuff like that. But for the purposes here, we're going to use anchor positioning. So of course, let's first talk about our button is our anchor, and our UL is our positioned anchored element. Now positioned is key there, and we'll get to that in a second. So here's our card options trigger. So we're going to say anchor name trigger, and then we have to reference that same name within our options. Position anchor, and that is trigger. And so now the two are what they call tethered. So the positioning isn't happening, but they're tethered together. So we know that the button and this unordered list are connected to one another. But we're not positioning yet at all. And to position it, what I'm going to do is, first of all, like I said, it has to be a positioned anchored container. So you can give it either position absolute or position fixed. Either of those are fine. So let's just say absolute for it now, and then we're going to do position, I'm going to use position area, and I'm going to say for this one inline end and then span block end. And I will show you a little nice tool from the folks over at Chrome Dev, where you can kind of figure out exactly how you want it and then what these lines should be. But of course, don't just use the tool, go read up what these mean and like when you say inline end, span block end, what that actually means. And then our all important fallbacks. So we're going to say position try fallbacks. And what we want to do is flip in line. And let's jump back to Chrome and let's see what we have. So now it's way over to the right. Way over to the right. Way over to the right. Why is that? Well, this is an interesting one. And there's a way to solve it right now with this, and I will show you in a second. So let me first explain the reason why it's happening. So of course, what we're doing here is we're giving our trigger a name called trigger, and then we're referencing it down here with the same name. But we have 3 of those triggers and 3 of these card options, and so every time it just reuses the same name. So what anchor positioning does is it finds the last instance and it's positioning it there every time. So you can see that is problematic and definitely not what we want. So you can solve it. Should I say now how you solve it? Yeah, sure. So in understanding how to use the polyfill, I ran into a couple of problems and I looked at the issues that was filed on the CSS anchor positioning repo, and I found this one over here where Popover finds different anchor, and I was kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what I'm seeing and I know why this is happening. But then I read down here and I read about anchor scope. Now, anchor scope is not yet documented on MDN, but if you look at the support here on Can I Use, it's the same support that you get for the rest of anchor positioning. And so I looked in the CSS documentation, and here you can see what this does. So this property scopes the specified anchor names and lookups for these anchor names to this element's subtree. Now that's important to remember, this element's subtree. So there's 3 possible values: none, which no changes; all specify that all anchor names, because you can give it more than one name, defined by this element or its descendants, whose scope is not already limited by a descendant using anchor scope, to be in scope only for this element's descendants. Okay, so a simple way of saying it is that this anchor name is scoped to this element, so let's say our trigger and all descendants of it, right? And then of course you can use a dashed ident, which is for example like dash dash trigger or something like that. We're not going to use a dashed ident, we're actually going to use all. But now the thing that is critical to notice here is its descendants. Now if you put anchor scope, for example, on here, which is our trigger itself, right? So if you do that here and we go back into Chrome and we click, so nothing is changed. In fact, now it's just always positioning it to the left again. And that is because if we look at our HTML, of course, our anchor element is not a child of the button, it's a sibling. But they are both children or descendants of our card container. So if we take anchor scope and we move it up to our card container, which is over here, and we put it here, and let's refresh. There we go. Now our problem is solved. And now you can see we have our implementation is done. So we have it opening to the right, which is what we want by default, but if there's not enough space, it opens to the left because of our fallback. But there's a couple of things to know here about, because we're using Popover, so there's a few things to know. First things first, and I believe I mentioned this in my previous video, but I'm going to repeat it here. So when you use Popover, your trigger and your popover. So in our case, it will be our button and our unordered list here. They are implicitly tethered. They're implicitly linked. There's a connection between the button and the popover that it controls. And so because of that, we can get rid of anchor name and the reference to it here, position anchor. And so if we go back, everything still works. Now, because we have this implicit tethering happening and we're not specifying a name, we don't have name collisions anymore, right? So we can then go back and we can remove our anchor scope. And so if we come back, everything still works. I'll refresh to be 100% sure, but it should auto refresh. Everything's still good. Now, the next thing is we're setting this to position absolute. Now, as mentioned, the element that you are anchoring, so not your anchor, but the element you're anchoring needs to be a positioned element, and it can be position absolute or it can be position fixed. Now, if we open this popover here and we inspect it, now, of course, we will see that right now it's set to position absolute. But if we scroll down a little bit more, we will see that we are overriding the default position fixed that the user agent would have already given to our popover. So that means when you're using popover, the only things you need in order to tether and then anchor and position your flyout are these two lines. And if you do not need a try fallback, then you technically only need a single line of CSS. So if we go back, we can refresh just to be sure, and indeed everything still works. And of course you can also tab and use the enter key and escape and all that kind of good stuff. So with these two lines, we've got it working. Nice. But as of today, April 27, 2025, this will only work in Chromium-based browsers. So how do we use it everywhere else? So now, of course, we're going to bring in our friend CSS Anchor Positioning Polyfill. As I mentioned by the folks at Oddbird, and specifically James, who's doing like a ton of work. He's over at Oddbird, and he's doing a ton of amazing work on this Polyfill. And he's so reactive to bugs that people file and all this kind of stuff. It's really, really amazing. But we can't just, for the way we're doing it specifically here, using position area and having these implicit connections between the trigger and the container and all of these things, we can't just add the Polyfill script and everything will just work. Believe me, writing CSS polyfills is hard. And if you want to know how hard, I highly encourage you to watch this video by Brahmas that he gave at BlinkOn earlier this year. It was posted 2 weeks ago. I'll put a link in the description to this, where he talks about a vision that he has for how we can potentially make writing CSS polyfills easier. But then before that, he talks about what the current state of affairs are and why it's so difficult. And if you watch this, your mind will be as blown as mine was to the fact that James and everybody else working on this is actually able to do what they're doing. So let's first of all appreciate that fact, and then let me show you how you can use it to get exactly the same effect in both Firefox and Safari. So let's dive in. First things first. We're going to go in here and we're going to link a different CSS, main with Polyfill, and then we're going to not use the one we've been using so far. The first thing we need to do is now we can't rely on that implicit mapping between the two. And of course, maybe in a future release of the Polyfill, the folks at Oddbird and James will add this ability, but today that is not possible. And because we're doing that, we of course want to avoid these naming conflicts. So we're going to start by adding our to our car container. We're going to add that anchor scope all. So now we know we're taking care of our naming conflicts. Then we're going to jump down to our our trigger, and of course now we have to give it our anchor name, and we'll just use trigger. And then we obviously have to add our position anchor down here on our flyout, our popover. So position anchor trigger. So now, oops, position anchor. So now we're tethered, but we're not positioning yet. Okay, so next thing we want to do is we want to position, but we're not going to use position area. Position area is supported by the Polyfill, but for our specific use case here, I found that I ran into quite a lot of problems to get it to position just the way I wanted. So for this specific case, there's another way of using anchor positioning that we'll use, and that is using the anchor function. So we now have to also position our, because we want to use position absolute. So for that, we'll obviously now explicitly tell it. So we'll say position absolute, and now we're going to use left and top. I tried this, and this is not just with the Polyfill, I tried this with logical properties. So doing like inset inline start and inset block start, but that doesn't work. So we're just going to use our physical properties. So we'll start with left, and then we use the anchor function. And first thing we do is we tell it the trigger. Well, we tell it what is our anchor. So in this case, it's called trigger. And then we want to position it to the right, on the right edge of our trigger. So we're going to say right. And then we want to do the same for top. And for top, we're going to go down here and we'll say top, anchor, trigger, top. Okay. So now we have position absolute. We're using our anchor function to position it to the right top. We also said position anchor. So we have our tethering, we're positioning. So let's see where we are at with Firefox. Now, of course, right now in Firefox, we're still getting it in the middle. And that is for the margin 0 issue that I mentioned before. So here I'm not using that utility. So I'm just going to add our margin right here, margin 0. Okay, let's refresh again. But now it's still sitting at the top left. Why? Well, because we haven't, we're not loading the Polyfill yet. Loaded from unpackage, like this. And so what this does, and you can find these examples and other ways to do it on the Oddbird anchor positioning Polyfill, and I'll link that in the description. So this is the default way of doing it. So it's just saying if anchor name is not in document.documentElement.style, then import CSS anchor positioning. So now if we flip back to Firefox, we click, yay, it works. But, that is not what we want. That is not what we want at all. So now what we want to do is, you would think, oh, we just need to add position try fallback. That doesn't quite work. So we need to do something a little bit different. It's not that much different, to be honest. So we're going to still do position try fallbacks, but now we're going to use one of those custom idents. So we're going to call it flip inline, just like the other one. And then we have to use this at try. Now here's something important before I jump into that. I set this custom property up here, options inline size, that I set to 13 rem. And that is then the inline size I set for the box that opens up. And the reason I do that is because this gives us now a predictable size for our popover, which is going to help us a heck of a lot in our add rule that we're about to add now. Okay, let's add our add position try. And of course it's called flip inline, and now I'm going to use left, and now we're going to do a calc. So, oops, oh no, that's not what I wanted to do. Anchor, trigger, and now we want to do the opposite side. So we had right, so we want left, and then we want to minus, and this is where that comes in useful, is our options inline size. So anchor at trigger left, but move it another 13 rem to the left. So at position try, yeah, that looks good. So let's go back and refresh. So this works, that works, and that one works exactly like it does in Chrome. So if we go back here, works, works, works. And of course in Chrome the script isn't running, right? Because it does support it. And let's flip over to Safari, and then we just refresh that, and boop, works a treat. Of course, when you use it with the Polyfill, it's a little bit more complicated in terms of just number of lines of code, more than anything, and then maybe the position try. But even still then, if you compare this to what it would be like to write this in JavaScript, especially the whole detecting that you're going to go off screen and to flip your little popover to the other side, this is still, in my opinion, a much nicer developer experience, and it just works. Once all the browsers ship support, which will happen this year, because again, as I've mentioned, it's part of Interop 25. So in this year, we will get support for anchor positioning in all three major browsers. Then, of course, you can feel free, depending on your support matrix, how far back you need to go with browser versions. You might be able to remove the polyfill and then simplify your CSS. But right now, today, you can get this card component with a nice little flyout that will automatically flip to the other side if there's not enough room, with a couple of lines of CSS and including Artbird's CSS anchor positioning polyfill. I hope you found this useful, that you learned something. As per usual, I will push this code up to GitHub. I will link it in the description. In main.css, so the component's called card with flyouts. It's in the components folder. And then if you look at main.css, that is how you could potentially do this in the future once support is across the board and in all the versions that you need to support. Until then, you can have a look at main-with-polyfill.css, and in there you will find the CSS that you can use in combination with Artbird's CSS anchor positioning polyfill to start using this today. Until the next one, leave your comments in the description. Not in the description. You can try, but that probably won't work. So leave it in the comments. If you like this one, give it a thumbs up. And if you want more content like this, hit the subscribe button, and be sure not to miss the next one. And until then, I'll stop rambling and leave you in peace. See you later.